the community was unable to do through the development of programs of excellence. And we talked about maturation, the development of a culture that grew over time and that changed and made us better. In 2011, you might remember that we talked about aging and the concern about becoming a little bit stagnant. And how do we make sure that our department continues to evolve and avoids aging. We talked the concepts about resilience, efficiency at the clinical enterprise, innovation, and always moving. I think those of you who are here might remember that. You know that in 2012, we were joining University of Louisville physicians. We were engaging in the electronic record. A lot of things were happening. There was a lot of anxiety in the air. There was transition happening. And we talked at that time about a process called lung transitional remodeling. And we used that to study that model and to inform the department about organization, or perhaps better, reorganization, to address how its function could be made better during times of transition. And then in 2013, we have been a year in a new enterprise. We have been a year involved in the electronic record. Kentucky Public Health had started. We had a new dean, and we were all stressed out. And the question I posed for you was, were these stressors or stimulants? Do you remember this? And I mentioned to you that in biology, a stressor or a stimulant cannot be defined until after the outcome. You do an engagement, an experiment, you perform an intervention, and if the outcome was negative for the cell or the model, that was a stressor. If the outcome was positive, that was a stimulant. And we summarized all the things that this department accomplished in the past year, and we concluded that all these changes were stimulants to this department. I hope you remember that, and I hope you remember this quote that I want to restate for you today. Challenges will come and go. The response to a challenge is genetically determined for cells and small organisms. Humans, on the other hand, have a choice. The choice to run away from or cave under the weight of a stressor, and the choice to reject the above and turn every challenge into a powerful tool for growth. We have continued to grow. Our research enterprise is strong. We are the best at educating trainees. We're moving into newer areas every day. We have changed whatever was thrown at us for a powerful tool for growth. I really believe that, and I hope you do too. But I want to change that conversation. If you look carefully at the focus of those grand rounds, you would conclude that Jesse Roman was talking about the health of a department. We're going to change the focus of that conversation this year. And we're going to move it and transition it to the health of those we serve. Now, there should be nobody in this room who will question why Jesse Roman wants to do this. Nobody. We are engaged in healthcare. But just in case, the best way to find yourself is to lose yourself in the service of others. And I want everybody in this room to lose themselves moving on this year. Now, every year I start by asking presenters to deliver grand rounds with a case. And I'm going to start with a very short case, a case that my pulmonary group has started seeing because I always use it, because it is the case that got me excited about lung fibrosis. This is a 66-year-old musician who I met many years ago in Atlanta, who had done very well as a musical group. His second part of his career, he was really a hobby, but he had recorded a number of CDs, and he was really excited about it. And he was the leader of his group. He brought his electric piano on stage every day. He prepared the sound system. He got the speakers going, the microphones. By the time his partners and other musicians came in, it was all set. By the time he sought medical assistant, the partners were putting everything on the stage, and he came in to play the piano, and he could hardly finish a set without stopping for quite some time to get some rest. And he was diagnosed with pulmonary fibrosis by his physicians, and he was treated for a number of years with a number of cocktails, including chronic steroid treatment. And he continued to progress and ultimately came to our attention. We found that he had dry cough, that he had significant dyspnea on exertion. On physical exam, he had bibasilar crackles at the basis of his lungs. He had clubbing in his fingers. His lung pulmonary function test revealed a restrictive physiology, classic of interstitial lung disorders. When he walked just a few steps, he desaturated, requiring long-term oxygen therapy, which he was not on. And his x-ray, as you can see, he had bilateral lymphotrace that in the CT was most prominent in the peripheral areas, and also the basal areas. You can see traction bronchiectasis and even some areas of honeycombing. If you do a biopsy in that lung, you know it's going to be fibrosis. And he was ultimately diagnosed with idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. The disease occupied my mind and that of Ralph and others for a number of years. We know a lot about this condition. We know that it happens in people over 50 years of age, and we now categorize it as a disease of aging. The older you are, the more likely you are to develop lung fibrosis. It is characterized by progressive dyspnea, and often when patients come to our attention, they've been experiencing something wrong with their breath for the past 2 to 3 years on average. It is idiopathic. We don't know what causes this, and it often is associated with smokers or ex-smokers. We know now that we need high-resolution CT scanning to do a good evaluation. Diagnosis is essentially impossible without high-resolution CT scan showing bilateral changes by basal predominance, traction bronchiectasis, and no other abnormalities to the point of calling it classic or definitive. If you don't have that definitive HRCT, you might need tissue in those patients who can tolerate this, where you can see a fibrosing pneumonitis that is heterogeneous. You see areas of fibrotic destruction of their architecture with no function whatsoever, and other areas that are normal. And then in some of these areas, you see the accumulation of fibroblasts and things that are called fibroblastic foci, which are thought to be the leading edge of the fibrosing process in this condition. But what gets them there and what prevents their continuous movement is still unknown. We know that this disease, now that we understand its pathology, and its pathology is called usual interstitial pneumonitis, is very different in outcomes with other idiopathic interstitial pneumonias. They have the worst outcomes. In fact, their survival is only 50% at 3 years. And these are 2 studies published in the late 1990s. IPF is the most common of the idiopathic interstitial pneumonitis that we see, and half of them will die within 3 years. We have been without medication and without appropriate strategies for the management of this condition, except for those few who can, lung transplantation. There's about 2,000 to 2,500 lung transplants done a year, with millions of people with lung disease. That means that the majority of the people do not have access to that opportunity. So if you are a patient with IPF, we have nothing for you. I'm exaggerating because I want to make a point that you'll see in a little bit. Until now, there's some hope that this will change. Just this year in the American Thoracic Society, there was a presentation, and it was published in the New England Journal of Medicine in May, of a new drug, which is a tyrosine kinase inhibitor, nintedanib, that has been tested prospectively in a randomized prospective trial, double-blinded, to look for its effectiveness. Now notice, there was a lot of data on this publication. I'm just showing you one graph. And what you see here is that there's nothing that talks about symptoms, or mortality, or survival, or feeling better, or oxygenation. All we're testing here is drop and lung function based on forced vital capacity, which I can measure by a simple spirometry. And what they found was that as these patients treated with placebo continued to deteriorate over a period of 52 months, the people on this drug deteriorated, but at a slower pace. Never been seen before, and has been touted as one of the new drugs that are going to become available. And yet, when I tested in my patients, I won't be able to tell them, you're going to feel better. You're going to do better. Second, the same American Thoracic Society meeting, the same New England Journal of Medicine, a second drug, already available in Japan, North America, and Canada, pirfenidone, showing the same thing, change in FVC, a drop in the patients at 52 months related to pirfenidone, related to placebo, and the pirfenidone slowing that rate down. And we're excited about this because this opens the door. Until now, we felt that fibrosis could not be reversed early, could not be perhaps slowed down. This suggests that it can, and will open the door for other studies to test new drugs. And we're really excited about this because a lot has happened over the decades about IPF. IPF was not known until the 60s or 50s, but we know that there's been lung fibrosis described since the early 1800s. There's a publication with 5 cases where the author actually talked about cirrhosis of the lung. Because the liver cirrhosis had been well described, but in lung it wasn't well known. And he was reminded about cirrhosis, so he called it fibrosis and cirrhosis of the lung. In the 1960s, we saw better descriptions of IPF, but there were people behaving differently. There was a concern that IPF was a sort of a bag of people with multiple diagnoses, and until pathologists came together to look at the histology and define the histology that I just presented you, that's when they said, these patients don't all have IPF, only patients with this specific histology have IPF. And then you saw the advent of more animal models and RT-PCR and molecular biology and genetics, and there were more studies about lung fibrogenesis, and that culminated on a feeling that we had a better understanding of this condition, so let's develop specialized centers for the care. You have one here, one of 9 centers in the United States in the network of pulmonary fibrosis that engage in those studies that I just mentioned before. And then in the 2000s, IPF becomes the best study interstitial lung disease in the world, with multiple clinical trials coming up almost every year. Okay? And that happened because now we have standardization of care. Now we have people coming together to do consensus statements. And we feel comfortable that we know how to take care of this. And we're proud because there have been great advances in diagnosis and management. Now, everybody who's in my field would agree with the statements I just made. But everybody in my field, when they sit down with their patient, feel a sense of disappointment. Because mortality has not changed a single bit since its description. Because new epidemiological studies are suggesting that the incidence of this disease is increasing. And because today, there are no effective treatments other than lung transplantation for the majority of the patients that I see every day. Now, I hope that you feel the same disappointment. I know that people in the cancer field feel that way. I know that people in the congestive heart failure world feel that way. The people who deal with diabetics, the people who deal with chronic obesity and hypertension and all these disorders, renal disease, you name it. You must feel this way every once in a while, that we have advanced greatly, and yet the statistics for our population haven't changed much for many of these conditions, and perhaps worsening over time. And that no matter how many patients I see in clinic, with 15 to 20 minutes for new, and 30 and 40 minutes for, you know what I mean, for new, and 50 to 20 minutes for those established, is not enough to change what we're doing. Kentucky, overall ranking, 45. Can't get much worse than that. Highest smoking rate in the nation. In past year, the prevalence of obesity increased from 30 to 31%. In past year, immunization coverage among children decreased. The number of children in poverty exceeds 1 in 4, the first time since 1995. Highest incidence of arthritis. Dr. Roberts, I put a plug for you. Health disparities all over the place. Highest levels of smoking, highest prevalence of rehospitalizations that could be preventable, high rate of cancer death, high air pollution. Now, I don't know you, but I sit with my patients every Friday afternoon, and I don't see that what I do is changing this. Do you? I want to change the conversation because this past month, I became 55, and I'm getting impatient. Day in and day out, I serve you. My life, my soul, devoted to you. And yet, I can't help you. I can't save you. What will it take? Do I know how? So I went back to history. And Genevieve, you're here. You've seen this before. But I think it's important, particularly for this round. I went back to Puerto Rico. And those of you who've been in Puerto Rico have had to go through this avenue, Ashford Avenue. And it takes you to Old San Juan, outside this image here. And if you keep on going, you go through a condado, you stop to a couple of casinos, you have a piña colada, you have some fun at the hotels, and you move on to the airport, which is right here, and come back. This avenue is named in honor of Dr. Bailey Ashford, who lived from 1893 to 1923. Who was Bailey Ashford? Well, he was a lieutenant in the military who was sent to Cuba during the Hispano-American War in 1898, the time in which this country began to exert its imperial power and obtained a number of possessions from Spain to the United States. And he was sent to Cuba, but a few months after being in Cuba, he was sent with General Nelson Miles to Puerto Rico. Now, I couldn't find much about what was happening exactly in 1898, but a few years earlier, Puerto Rico was less than about 700,000 people, half of them white, half of them characterized as of color. Category included blacks, mulattoes, mestizos. Remember that we have a heritage of Indians, as well as Africans, as well as Spanish, and now Americans. Most lived in extreme poverty, agriculture. The main source of income was limited by the lack of roads, rudimentary tools and equipment, natural disasters, hurricanes, droughts happening all the time. Illiteracy, over 80%. I imagine that this is what Bailey Ashford identified and encountered when he stopped, got off the boat in Puerto Rico during the Hispano-American War. This is what he saw on the countryside of where people lived. Some people may even today, in this country too. Let me read you what I found in the internet from the Office of Medical History of the U.S. Army Department of Medical Affairs. Since the Spanish Board of Health had been almost purely ornamental, physicians were confronted from the outset with the island's dirt and stench, its filthy small huts and overcrowded, wretched hovels. Like their counterparts in Cuba, Puerto Rican communities were in a filthy condition. A Marine Hospital Service physician wrote in 1990 that the inhabitants of Ponce, today the second city in the island, were a class of people of no great endurance, badly infected, living in unhygienic surroundings, always on the verge of sickness. Because the barracks were located in the midst of Puerto Rican community, any disease that threatened the civilians was a potential threat to occupying troops. Now that becomes the reason to take care of Puerto Ricans, not because they were sick, because they could infect or affect the troops. And public health on the island became a major concern, and of course, Dr. Bailey Ashford was the physician. Now, one of the things that he encountered, of course, there was a lot of tuberculosis and malaria and yellow fever and all that. There was anemia. Pale, edematous, short of breath, lack of energy, non-productive, lazy. The Puerto Rican of 1898, lazy. Okay? Many of these had anemia. About 16,000 deaths per year. 1/3 of the population deaths per year were related to this anemia. And I want you to read this from a biography written by Ashford. It was a stewing hot afternoon in the Caribbean with the sun pouring into the stuffy bare room 6 feet by 10. Yet still he sat with his eye glued to a portable military microscope. He has been sitting there since early morning. In fact, he has sat there most of the time since the hurricane, which had driven hordes of pallid refugees, sick refugees, lazy refugees from their mountain homes to seek food and shelter in the city. Their power was not brought on, however, by the hurricane. Only 3 months passed. It was the power of years, of centuries. It was the seal of a disease no one had ever deciphered. But of that disease, they died. Had for years been dying. Until now, when asked of what they had lost father, mother, and other kin, they answered, de la anemia, de la muerte natural. You like my accent? Of the anemia, of the natural death. He looked at those people and he tested them as much as he could. He looked at blood and he looked at urine and he examined them day in and day out, and finally he looked at the stool and he saw something. And he said, what was the oval thing with the four fluffy gray balls inside? This has no business here. It is undoubtedly an egg, probably a worm. And he looked into a shelf, and in that little room he only had 5 books, and one of them happened to be Manson's Tropical Diseases. And he goes page by page and he finds this same image. An image as a parasite found in certain anemic Italians that had been described while they were working in a tunnel in Switzerland. And he found what it was. And it was Ancylostoma duodenale, Musciniorasis. My ancestors were dying one after the other by this bug that has a very interesting, like many other worms, nematode. My father happens to be a nematologist, so he was very into this history. And it has an interesting life cycle from humans to animals. And if you're walking around without shoes and people are defecating next door to your house, and you're walking around, you get infected, this gets hooked onto your intestines and feeds and creates anemia and a lot of other problems, and people die from this. And so the question that I want to pose for you is, what do you do with that finding? First of all, you have to be talented enough and have enough education and experience to say, aha, that's important. Second, you have to have the ability and the passion to push people around you to believe that this is the cause of the disease and that this is worth managing. That this is worth managing. In 1904, the legislature appropriated $5,000, I assume that's a lot of money then, to establish the Anemia Commission. Today, people use it to go to California for a meeting. He established an Anemia Commission ran by Dr. Ashford. He treated the disease with fig and salt, followed by a dose of Timol to kill parasites. The first campaign, they did up to 4 campaigns. They treated 5,400 individuals. 22,000 were considered to be cured in 18 months. The death rate from anemia in Puerto Rico dropped from 16,000 to 1,000 per year in a few years. Over the following years, the research intensified, sanitary regulations improved, and construction and use of latrines were promoted, treatment centers, and now people were educated about how to do this. Simultaneously, an educational campaign was started. Methods of treating the illness were disseminated and tested. In 8 years of campaign, over 300,000, half of the population, were cured and death decreased 90%. Implications for the Caribbean and South America and also the southern United States were important because the disease was in the area of the tropics. And Ashford becomes a world expert in tropical diseases and goes as far as Egypt, where he wins an award for addressing tropical diseases. And with that, he realized that there's no actual entity, there's no actual infrastructure to continue this work. So he proposes the development of an institute, the Institute of Tropical Medicine, where Ashford and other scientists study tropical diseases, tuberculosis, yellow fever, and even cancer. And it is that entity that later on in 49, the legislature agrees to convert into the School of Medicine in Puerto Rico. And the first class starts in 1950. My father-in-law becomes a member of the 4th class of this school. And I become a member of the 1983 class. This is the latest class. Now here's the first big question for you. How many of us will have the opportunity to make such an important discovery, implement strategies that save hundreds of thousands of lives, change healthcare delivery in a country and beyond, establish a science institute that improves the infrastructure for the training of future generations of doctors, and ultimately has a chair sitting at the University of Louisville? Did you get it? Because I won't be able to do this sitting on Friday afternoons, patient after patient. And yet they need for me to do this. I need to do that. Well, we got to think beyond that. We have to think beyond that. So I want to give you this slide. This is my own personal slide. I made this slide. But it is my impression that when you think about advances in politics and education and cultural issues in Puerto Rico, for centuries, that island in the Caribbean was silent and dying, I would add. And then things start picking up. Now that coincides with Ashford. And you would argue that a lot of things were happening. A lot of things were happening around the world, and he will be the first to say this was not my doing. But he will also be the first to say that this would never happen when you have a population that is sick the way this state is sick. And the two things I can come up with from that history is that it takes discovery and it takes implementation at the level of the population. And I'm not an expert in this area, but I don't know how else to consider this history and implement it today. I want you to think about that. Now, you would argue, well, not everybody is a Bailey Ashford. Nothing great will ever achieve without great men, and men are great only if they are determined to do so. I would argue that you're right. Not everybody is a Bailey Ashford. But together, we have the talent, resources, and power, more than Bailey Ashford had in a 6x10 room with a little microscope and a book by Manson. So the question then is, how do you transfer that information to the department? How does a department position itself to change in ways that truly impact the population at large? And until now, we have been discussing about how do we establish the department. We've been talking about the health of the department. We talked about growth, maturation, specialization, discovery, implementation. We talked about that we needed sufficient people. We talked about programs of excellence. We have sophisticated research. I think what we failed is in implementation. We're very good at implementing healthcare at the individual level. I have the best doctors in town. I know that. But I can only document it in what they do when they're sitting in front of their patient. And as we discussed, how many patients do you have to see for how many years to have the impact that baby Asher had in a state like Kentucky? It wouldn't happen. It wouldn't happen. So I'm going to bring the concepts of legislature, of which I know very little, and population health, of which I know less. Okay? But I told you that my interest today is not to answer in detail your questions, but to inspire you for us together to come up with the answers this year. Now, let's talk about how we got to where we are, because it is that infrastructure that now allows us to jump into the next stage of this department. Growth. We wanted to grow. We were at 140 when I arrived here. We're a little over 200. Because of that, and because of the effort that you guys display day in and day out, our RVUs, which we now measure, and now I have a way to measure the work that we do, is close to 400,000 RVUs a year. This was much more than in 2009, although this number is skewed because we didn't have good data then. But some people in the audience may not understand this. If all of you were gastroenterologists, you would generate these RVUs. If all of you were neurologists, you would generate these RVUs. And by the way, I'm not talking about all of you, because we only have about 50 total FTEs at the clinic. Out of the 204 faculty, only 50 full-time FTEs are at the clinic generating the work that we do, which is massive. And that work has generated a budget of over $100 million. From the researcher side, from the educator side, from the clinician side. We are doing extremely well. And I've told you that over the years, that this was important to create an infrastructure for the next level. Today we're discussing what that next level is. I wanted to highlight the people who joined us this year. I don't know how this happened. We had a freeze this year, remember? It was a budgetary issue, but we still needed to invest in certain areas. We still needed to target. We're not staying still. We're not becoming stagnant. We have to continue to grow. Growth was at the center of the plan we had implemented 5 years ago. So all these people, I don't know if you can see it from there, but who's new this year here? Who is new? I see one hand over there. Who else? I see somebody else moving their hand, then immediately bringing it down. It's okay to say yes. Why don't you stand up if you're new? Come on. An applause to the only person we have. Anybody to know. Okay? I want to particularly thank Dr. Shao, who may be here or actually may be seeing patients, because we had a little emergency of bone marrow transplantation, as you know. And he has come to join us to help us in BMT. And I am pleased to say that with the help of Don Miller and others, we have now signed on of a letter of intent for a new chief of bone marrow transplantation, who is currently an associate professor and eminent scholar and co-leader at his place. And you can tell that I will not give you more information because this is not formal until it is formal. But it's been only 2 months since that crisis generated, and we will soon, very quickly, be able to address that because we're not staying still. Now, with growth, a lot of things happen. We produce over 400 publications a year. We have a number of awards that come to faculty in this department. We have two members, Dr. Bowley and Dr. Jeff Kalin, who may be here today, who have 3 Lifetime Achievement Awards. Out of the School of Medicine Distinguished Awards, out of all the School of Medicine Distinguished Awards in the past 5 years, over half of them come to faculty in the Department of Medicine. There's a reason for that. There's a reason for that. And we have promoted close to 30 people. We have inducted over 35 people in the Southern Society for Clinical Investigation. We have a few new chairs and endowments, and we have several new distinguished university scholars and university scholars. That growth has allowed us to get talented people to ensure that we continue to do well. My apologies, I just I'm getting too passionate up here, and this just Now, I want to celebrate Dr. Bowley, who soon will get the Excellence Research Award of the Doctor Bowl, and Dr. Youssef, who I think I saw up there somewhere. There she is, who will receive a Compassionate Physician Award. Thank you both for what you do for the patients of this organization. And I want to celebrate Dr. Marius Radishak, who got a very prestigious international award, the Carl Laysanger Prize. So if you see any of these people, stop for a minute to say thank you for what you do and celebrate them. Now, with that also comes specialization. And we talked about how we have new programs and new training programs, and these are just a few examples. I couldn't list them all. Rheumatology division and fellowship. We have a world-class GI motility program. We have an academic model of critical care delivery in the CCU and MICU at the Jewish Hospital, which people told me that will never happen. We have new programs in pulmonary medicine and lung transplantation, pulmonary hypertension, interstitial lung disease, cystic fibrosis, interventional pulmonology. We have a disease management program together with the University of Louisville. We have structural heart program. And I could add 2 or 3 slides of new things that you have brought into this organization that distinguishes us from the community, in fact, distinguishes us from what's happening in the region. And that provides us the foundation to move where we need to go. With increased discovery comes productivity. You've seen this slide before. But how do we measure that? Well, there's no good websites to look at comparisons about education or patient care. But there's a good website about discovery and research. And it's in dollars. How many dollars do you get from the federal government? And we were at 19 million. Now we're a little close to 23 million. And our rank, which the lower the better, continues to improve. We're now at 43, which means that in the School of Medicine in the United States, there are over 130, we are in the top 50 of departments of medicine ranked by the NIH. Now, you should be proud of that, as I am. And I've told you other times that this is important, but it also doesn't highlight one important aspect of this, because the NIH ranking is based on absolute dollars. It doesn't account for the number of people we have. If you actually did the calculations of dollars per people, we would actually be at the same level as Cornell, Emory, and others, because we're a fairly small department. But don't be happy yet. Here's a point that I want to make today. UofL is 72 or 73 in the NIH ranking. If you look at UofL as dollars per faculty, it actually looks worse at 80. With an institution very close by coming closer and closer. That institution that came out of filthy, stingy group of people in the Caribbean, by that same criteria, is now 43. Now you explain that to me. And I would argue that part of the issue is that the Department of Medicine alone cannot drive this change. The entire institution has to engage in this change, and other departments have to be part of this progress in research and education that we're doing, and in engaging population health. We can be the drivers of this, but we cannot do this alone. Now, of course, there's more. We collapsed UMA. We started University of Louisville Physicians, which is a now $140 million corporation, the largest multi-specialty corporation in this region. We're the early users of electronic record. Most of us are now in the electronic record. We expanded to Southern Indiana. We expanded to Jewish Hospital more than we were before. We standardized faculty evaluations. We have addressed more faculty promotions. We became part of Kentucky One Health. I could go on and on and on. And each of these things were a stimulant based on how well you have done. Kudos to you. Kudos to you, and I'm very proud. But not everything is perfect. We need space, more space, to accommodate a new program. Dr. Roman, you already have space. You already are the largest department university. I don't care. We have a mission. We need the space. We need the resources to continue to grow. We need to expose more students and residents to meaningful research experiences. We need to improve our efficiency in the clinical arena in care delivery, billing, staffing, not because it fills our pocket, but because our patients deserve it. And yet, despite all these benefits, when we moved into UOP, we lost some ground, and we developed a $4.5 to $5 million deficit that remains today. I've discussed this deficit with you last year and this year. And you would say, well, Dr. Roman, how are we going to take care of that? Well, first of all, keep your fingers crossed. Second, you engage in a number of initiatives that the divisions have actually done, clinical improvements, reorganization of the staff. reevaluation of our recycle management. You have to improve revenue, so the divisions have been in agreement to provide a one-time tax, and that was very helpful, and I thank the division directors for pushing that through. Reorganize the administration, and a lot more. Number two, dollars from the hospitals. We can't do what we do for the indigent population of this town without more dollars from the hospitals. And I'm glad that Mark Pfeiffer is here and his colleagues, because they've been extremely helpful in doing this. And this year, we're expected to increase the dollars that are coming from the hospital, and the dollars that are coming from Kentucky One Health are projected to be around $9 million. Now, this is not formal. A little birdie suggested that to me, and I think we'll be close to that. Not enough. We need more. And people will say, well, Dr. Ullman only wants to build an enterprise. For the right reason, I'll build anything. Okay? Now, of course, we're still waiting for CHI investments. And we expect there will be millions of dollars in that invested in primary care and critical care and cardiovascular and all these services and even more. So we think there will be enough resources to cover our deficit, but also to engage in new enterprises and new initiatives. But I want you to rethink carefully in those initiatives. Just bringing a new physician to add another clinic and cover another month at the hospital will not get us to where we need to be. And the statistics for Kentucky will be identical, way beyond my retirement. Way beyond my retirement. So how does the department position itself to drive change in ways that affect our community? Just one slide on legislative health. Now, how many of you engage in smoking cessation at the clinic? I hope everybody raises their hand. Go ahead, even if you don't. Okay? Now, it's part of what we need to do. It's part of meaningful use. We all recognize that tobacco is an important problem. However, I would challenge you to find me a person that has been very successful at getting people to stop smoking, and in 2 years from now, having those people remain in smoking cessation before they develop a disease. I'm a pulmonologist. This is what I do, and I'm not that successful. And Dr. Paris, who's sitting there, would tell me the same, although he tells me that the VA, they do it better. Okay? And the point I want to make is that it's been only through legislative changes that big impacts have been held. Smoking is going down because we taxed cigarettes. Smoking is going down because we voted for bans in the workplace and in the community enclosed spaces. That's the way smoking is going down. Yes, we've had an impact. Yes, you with your patients should engage in smoking cessation, but if you want to take care of hundreds of thousands of people and make a change in your lifetime, you need more. We need to be engaged at the legislature level. And I don't know how to do that. I've been to Congress twice. I've served the VA and the American Thoracic Society. It's an incredible opportunity to meet people, and hopefully you're not the only one there, and touching that door and asking for people to do better. We need to be all find out how KMA and GMLS and all these other organizations help this department, how we partner with them to engage with ACP and others, AML. All of these organizations to try to do better in this level. This is an article that came in USA Today on November 12th. Because instead of a paper, I really wanted to just show you a magazine. Smoking bans had a number of heart attacks and strokes. Smoke-free laws were followed by fewer hospitalizations for respiratory disease. They were discussing a couple of articles that came out around that time. Look at the impact in heart attacks, stroke, and respiratory disease based on bans. We need to engage more in that. Now, how about implementation? We talked about that we need to do better there. We're going to talk about quality projects. We're going to talk about personalized medicine. We're going to talk about global health and other initiatives that could be like this. We're going to talk about community health. We're going to talk about legislative approach, which I've pretty much distinguished what I was going to tell you today. And we're going to talk about furthering discovery. So let me start with quality improvement. For the first time, I demanded my division chiefs to come up with a project this year on quality improvement and safety. They didn't give it much time. It was rushed. They had less than 6 months of doing it. Some of them wanted to do a big research project, IRB, since it's still flawed, we couldn't get it together. And yet, look at what's happened in those 6 months. Internal medicine improved food evaluations in diabetic patients. Endocrinology examined the impact of guidelines for hospital management of hyperglycemia. Cardiology reduced rehospitalizations related to congestive heart failure to 10.5% at the VA. GI documented that they were indeed engaging in appropriate techniques for lesion detection. They actually were a higher detecting rate than the national average, which brings an interesting question. Internal medicine palliative care evaluated the completion rate of advanced directives in clinic, which we were not doing so well. Pulmonary is evaluating the role of goal-directed therapy. And oncology improved documentation of treatment intent and consent to 60%. 6 months. One request. If you do that 5 years in a row, you'll have 50 projects. If 20 to 30% of them change the way we do things, we're on our way. And this year, I put on notice to my division chiefs. You'll get an email. Let's start today. We're going to start on our next project. And what I want is the fellows and the residents and the students to be engaged. And each division will start this year. Trainees to be included. And I want nominations this month, if possible, for people who are interested in serving as directors of quality improvement and safety for the department. I need only one champion. I could have more. All I need is one champion to drive this forward. When we talk about personalized medicine, we talk about discovery. How many of you have witnessed a discovery move to the clinical arena? You may have seen a new antibiotic emerge. You may have seen something like that. But how do we move it forward? Well, at UofL, there's actually a biotech, a company developed at UofL that engages in pharmacogenetic testing. There are assays already that are available for clinical use that we could use in the clinic to ensure avoid side effects from certain medications. So the question for them that I posed, and I met with Dr. Juan Valdez and his group and PGX, and we talked about what are the assays that are ready for clinical use to predict this? How do we incorporate it in a clinical arena with our setting, and would insurance companies pay for this? Are there assays that are ready for testing prospectively because there's not enough data to be used? I don't want this to be used for the sake of using them. They better make a difference. And so Mike Wyer, Steve Winters, Carrie Lenneman, some of you have been voted to be part of this committee. Some of you already know this. But we're already on target to begin discussions about how do we implement this. And that will be important so that we're not only serve as a differentiator for us in the clinic, but we also make a difference for our patients. Nephrology is all doing that. Nephrology has been doing this, and last year Mike Wyer, I think, presented on a computer algorithm that they have used to diminish transfusions and the injection of erythropoietin. And it's shown already in a study that they decreased transfusion rate of patients per year, and in the clinical practice, this is what they use in their units, and that has already improved. That's oncology is using this for cancer, for evaluation of genetics and defining treatment strategies. We should be doing that here in every patient. If we have the technology to do so, we need to do that. I want to bring this up very briefly because Dr. Ramirez actually presented this last year about the Global Health Initiative. He talked to you about he's engaged in comprehensive HIV clinic, the largest clinic in the region for patients with HIV. And now that clinic has incorporated more. And the patients have welcomed the ability to be the foundation for a larger program that includes international travel clinics, refugee health, immunization, civil surgeon clinics, and more. This group with Carico and others in ID, a fairly small division with a big, big vision. There's a lot of people in this room who are now serving, students, residents, fellows who work in this initiative. We need more of this. By the way, if you see a van around here that says Global Health, it's not my fault. We just got them a van to be able to vaccinate whoever they want throughout town. And if you're admitted with pneumonia anywhere in Jefferson County, they will know it within 48 hours because they're doing that epidemiological study, so we study this. So what initiative do you have in mind that could have this impact? Community health. The traditional approach to community health is that a major place starts metastasizing and sends people elsewhere. I have to be frank with my audience. I have been somewhat against this approach in the past 5 years. Why? Because I felt that we needed to be strong at the mothership and do that well before we dilute our efforts to go elsewhere. That does not mean that this is not important. It just means we need enough people to do it and do it right. We still don't have sufficient people. or we now have the ability to begin to engage in some of this metastasis process. But importantly enough, not all this process of community health has to be done with the physical presence of a physician there. We should be connecting with School of Nursing, School of Public Health, School of Social Work, AmeriCorps, private foundations. Our students might be excited about how to do this across the state. But how do we do this in a strategy that is well developed with an appropriate budget, that is well evaluated with outcome criteria and research that incorporates all the tenets that I just mentioned to you about? And Barbara Casper and I have been talking about this over the past few weeks of how do we incorporate this, and we think we have a plan. Now, research has to continue, because I told you before that the two things were implementation and discovery. And of course, when you address the issues at the clinic, it has to be translational research. Every single patient is a potential candidate for study. We conduct hundreds of trials at the clinic each day in the hospitals. We have now a new clinical trials unit, HUC, ran by McLean and his group, that I think it's ready to go. Is that correct?
Yep.
And Siri and other people at Kentucky One Health is trying to improve our process. The process is terrible. The process has managed to threaten our ability to conduct research, but there's people there that I'm convinced that know what they have at stake and understand that if they're going to be differentiating from the rest of the community and healthcare delivery in this town, that they better be able to move clinical trials in a safe and a quick way. We need UOP to actively promote clinical research. This is no longer the time where we engage in research at a building owned by UOP. This is the time for UOP to say, no, this is what UOP is about. Great patient care and access for those patients to get the newest strategies. UOP has to be involved in this strategy. We need to move after NCI designation, and we need to get a CTSA, and there's renewed enthusiasm for these things. We need to get C32 grants, because I have learned that spending a couple of $1 million and bringing one group may not change a lot. It has impact. It has an impact, and it has an impact here. But at some point, we need to generate the future discoverers of tomorrow. And that may be accelerated tremendously, as it's done in many other places, to NIH grants that support residents, or particularly fellows. And what's important is that we're going to have to reorganize our clinical enterprise to allow this, because this requires fellows to engage in a year or two of uninterrupted research. Why? Because we don't need clinicians who engage in research every once in a while. We need clinician investigators. And that requires as much effort and sacrifice and investment and education and funding as a physician scientist does. We need to train and mentor the true clinician investigators. So what have I told you? Because my time is running out. I've told you that in 2009 to 2010, you became adjusted to a new chair. Perhaps you're still trying to do that. New recruitments, new departmental processes. The year after that, we engage in more growth and specialization by the development of programs of excellence and defining our strategy. The year after that, we matured a little bit more. We continued to recruit. We joined UOP and created UOP. This was created by the faculty and physicians of this organization. We integrated it into the electronic medical record. We started to strengthen the foundation last year with clinic rearrangements, administration reorganization, improving our billing processes, standardization of faculty evaluations and promotions. Kentucky One Health came to life. A lot of things going on. A lot going on. We wouldn't have it any other way. We don't have time. I'm 55 and I'm getting impatient. And so this year we're going to start. Where do we go on these new investments? How do we engage in quality and safety? How do we engage in personalized medicine? How do we engage in community engagement, telemedicine, whatever strategy you want to use, and continue with discovery? Vision, culture, strategy, implementation, maturing, and translation or implementation at the population level. That's the strategy. That's what it's been all about. Sometimes without us knowing. Okay? I want to leave you in the last 2-3 minutes with my friend Tito. My pulmonary colleagues know Tito. Tito Accinelli, Roberto, was given the International Health Award at the American Thoracic Society just 2 years ago by the work that I'm going to present to you. Tito is from Cayetano Heredia. I think we have a couple of faculty who are from there. There's somebody raising their hand. You know Tito? Because everybody who's in this country doing pulmonary medicine comes from Tito. Because he has devoted to his career for his patients and for his trainees. And we see him running around in the American Thoracic Society with 10 or 15 people that often he pays out of his pocket to bring them there. He's not complaining that his chair doesn't have enough money to bring them. He brings them. Okay? And what Tito realized is that many of his patients were dying, or that there was a lot of absenteeism to work and to school in his country. And many of his patients had respiratory disease, and many of them were non-smokers. And when you go to the countryside and you realize the conditions in which many of these people live, what you realize is that they cook in this room where they live. And they're exposed to biomass day in and day out. They sleep in that room, they eat in that room, they socialize in that room, and they think about living in that room, being raised in that room throughout your life. And all these particles and all this dust and all this smoke being inhaled in and out 15 to 16 times a minute every year of your life. 41% of the population use biomass for cooking. In Peru alone, this is a worldwide problem. A worldwide problem that is beyond tobacco. Okay? And what he started to do is to look at what the data is. And he found correlations between the exposure to wood, because that's what they use for cooking, and cough. He found correlation, negative correlation between exposure to that and lung function. He found correlations between that and level of oxygenation. But he didn't stop there. That was discovery. That was discovery. The question is, how do you move into implementation? And he could have said, I don't have enough dollars. He could have said Cayetano Heredia has a budget deficit. He could have said the institution doesn't have the resources because we have to take care of the individual patient. We don't have the resources to engage in population health. So for years he worked at this and got together industry and the government for them to be able, here's discovery again, to develop these stoves with these simple ventilation systems that could be created in less than $70. I think it's now lower than $60 per person. He got enough resources to install this in 500 homes throughout his city, particularly in the mountains. And what he found, the first thing he found is, look at the carbon monoxide level. Dropped to less than half. Now, you don't have to tell me a lot about health. I understand that number. Look at the particles, respiratory particles. Tremendous drop. And he started to loot data. Much of this data not published yet. I got it from his presentation, where he looks at cough, expectoration, expectoration for 2 weeks, dyspnea, and a lot of other parameters that I want to discuss today. And look how they're starting to drop before and after. Before and after these homes. Pneumonia, acute bronchitis, before and after. Women are the most affected. Don't know what I did. This is the most exciting part of the talk. And I just messed it up. Women are the most affected because they're there, cooking in and cooking out and taking care of the family, no? So I want to leave you with this quote because I hope that today you are inspired to go home, finish your daily duties. I know we all are very busy. Go home and start thinking about how am I going to change this town, this state, and this country? How am I going to make a big difference? And what is the reason why I'm doing this? Now, you may or may not agree with this philosophy, but let me get you back to Bariatric. He said, the doctor's mission from this time forward, the department's mission from this time forward, if you will, as I see it, is not so much a relief of pain or a prevention of death, as it is a question of salvaging this man, this woman, this child for 100% efficiency in the future. Now that sounds like a very mechanistic vision. It's not touchy-feely. I want to make people efficient. This is not about making robots. It's about improving health. Because if you're sick, nothing happens except death. That's what he's saying. You can change a town, a state, a country, healthcare, if you make people healthy. But you have to engage in discovery, and you have to engage in implementation. How do we improve the health of Kentuckians so that they can be 100% efficient, so that they can improve our economy, education, our politics, and so on? That's the driver. That's the driver. Thank you.
My apologies for going a little bit over the time. Any questions?
I wish everybody would stay sitting. I wish everybody would stay sitting until the speaker leaves. You don't have to do it for me, but to do it for our next speakers, particularly those who come from the outside. One of the things I get every year is speakers from the outside being amazed at us coming together every week. Grand rounds are falling apart at every institution I know, and this place sustains grand rounds for a reason. Rob Harris, did you have a question?
Yes, I do.
Oh, you need a microphone. I've never had a question coming with a person coming up here.
So 5 years ago, almost to the day, our new chairman stood before us and told us about a shared vision. Shared because he understands that one person can't do things alone, that it takes a family and organization to do it. And key to that is, just as he said, are this activity here, these grand rounds. Okay? Now he reminds us of that every year by sending us a letter. And I just got mine. It's dated August 28th. Just got it a few days ago. I'm just going to pick a couple of pieces because I know time is short.
Oh God, this is not good.
So it says, Dear Dr. Perez, blah, 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 blah. However, constant throughout my tenure has been my belief that our weekly medicine grand round lectures are a vital component of our strategy designed to help us become the top academic internal medicine department in our region and are key to providing the best in medical education to our fellows, residents, and students. Yada, yada, yada. Your participation in this endeavor has been somewhat lacking, and I order you from now until you die to attend every single Your friend, Jesse. That last part I sort of made up. But as you know...
Sort of.
sort of made up. Yeah. But as you know, we have many distinguished speakers who come to our grand rounds, and we have some very special occasions in which these speakers talk to us. They come from all over the country, all over the world, and at the end we recognize them and we give them a token of our appreciation for them being here. And this, everyone knows, is the famous Louisville bat, something that's very unique to our community and no one else in the world does. And I think sometimes if you sit up close, you can see some subtle things that happen to Jesse when he hands over that bat. He holds on to it a little bit longer, you know, and maybe there's a little anxious drool that comes out the side of the beard that you and I have made prematurely white, right? And so I know that he's thinking in his head, damn, I wish I could have one of those bats. So Jason, please. Oh. I'm going to present you with your very own damn bat.
Wow. Thanks,
Grab
Crystal.
it yet. That says, Dr. Jesse Roman, MD, Professor and Chair, Department of Medicine, University of Louisville.
Wow. Thank you so much. This is what it's all about. It's not the bat. It's the time, the emotion, the things that we bring to the table.